Hey, 420 MSP, exciting times in the cannabis industry. We are back with the doctor, Dr. Paul Seaborn. How you doing today, Paul?
Doing great, Harry. Nice to see you.
Yeah, as always. Got New York on my mind, and you wanted to contribute some other geographies. So New York has kind of got the hot hand. What's going on, man?
Yeah, I think we've talked for a while, Harry, that the topic of legalization has become generally popular, right, across all demographics, political parties, rural, urban. But yet that's not ever quite enough to get a legislature or a governor to really push. So I guess what I've been seeing in New York and a couple other states is you always need the popularity and something else. And I think we had one of those something else's in New York where this is a time where the governor was looking for some good news, maybe
Yeah,
distracting. And so, this is going to work because it is popular across most of those different cuts. And there's an undercurrent also of economic development, knowing that some neighboring state like New Jersey are moving
yeah,
forward, and we don't want to lose all the opportunity to them. So I think it just kind of shows you that formula. You need to build up the popularity and then wait for that other thing to cut. And what's interesting with New York is it did move really quickly from not really being on the radar to going all the way through and getting signed by the governor. So the other two states that I'm going to talk about are my home state, current home state, Virginia, and then New Mexico. And so again, in Virginia, politically popular if you poll people, but it wasn't really a distraction story, and it wasn't really necessarily the economic development. But I think a growing realization that to think about social justice and to think about where people are being mistreated is to think about the negative impacts of having this as an illegal substance. So if you look at the announcement in Virginia where they've moved up the legalization date to this July 1st or July 4th, I forget which one, it's really framed around social justice, that they feel like the longer we wait, the longer we're not treating people fairly and freely, and that makes it a priority. So interestingly, with Virginia, they still have a 3-year time planning horizon for actually commercializing the industry, which is often that next step after legalization. Personally, I think that's going to get moved up. I don't see the state sitting in this limbo state for 3 years, but I think politically you do one thing at a time. We'll legalize July 1st, and then they can come back and talk about that later. And then last but not least, New Mexico. So if your viewers and listeners were watching that, the governor there also signed bills to legalize, and that's moving relatively quickly. And she highlighted both of those concerns: social justice, but also economic development, and the fact that they see jobs, they see revenues, and COVID is hitting state budgets pretty hard. And so it was always popular for the last little while, but it needed those other couple things to get it over the finish line. And so I think that's the formula. You look into other states, you need to see either some economic motivation, social justice motivation, or I guess if you need some good news, to distract for something else.
yeah, yeah, exactly. On the geography front, one of our other analysts, Kat Zalmers, spoke with her recently. She's in the New York City area, and of course, there's a lot of excitement. And she was saying, uh, and vaccinations are starting to happen and people are starting to get outside. But she's saying the word on the street is a lot of people are going to have rooftop parties on April 20th, 420 in New York.
Yeah, the other, I think, amazing stat I saw, which your audience might be interested in, Illinois is the one state that's really been reporting out how many out-of-state sales they're making in their legal market, which only legalized a year ago for adult use. And the most recent numbers were 30% of their adult use sales are from non-Illinois customers. And if you run the math, that's about $10 million of tax revenue a month and growing. And so I don't care what kind of governor you are. If you see $10 million a month going to Illinois' pockets, and maybe it would have been shared amongst Indiana or Ohio or Iowa or wherever, that's going to get noticed. And that wasn't really a thing in Colorado or some of these other places because there's nobody popular and dense right on the border. But yeah, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, they're in the center of a lot of population, and it's going to be hard to ignore that going forward. Not necessarily ideal for a country to have people crossing state borders and doing things that are legal in one state
I
versus
agree.
another, but that's the world we live in right now, unfortunately.
Yeah. Back in, I was briefly in a startup, the 411 on 420, that was ultimately a podcast about government affairs and compliance and based out of Olympia, Washington, basically. And as we talked to, I think it was Rick Garza, the head of the Washington State and Liquor Cannabis Control Board, they showed some heat maps, and Spokane, Washington was all lit up in red. And I'm like, I wonder why that is. That's a little more conservative part of the state. Well, it was Idaho. Coming across the border. Hey, another question on geography, then I want to take a right angle to a different topic. But you were there essentially at the beginning, and I followed several years later in your pathway. Do you think New York will come online much faster than Colorado and Washington State did, because those two states had to define the paradigm, right, of what it is to come online? And I'm assuming we're going to see time compression.
Yeah, now even Washington and Colorado differed because of the nature of those ballot initiatives. So the crafters of the language in Colorado basically locked in January 1st, 14 months after the federal election.
Okay.
If we vote yes, it's happening no matter what. You better get your ducks in a row and get some regulations going, or we're just going to have the real Wild West. And so that put them on a pretty aggressive timeline, probably one of the most aggressive since ever. Washington didn't have that burning deadline, and so they were probably a little more careful. But yes, I think your general idea is correct that there's been so many states now. Each time there is an opportunity to move faster. The only counter factor is we also have higher expectations, I think, as citizens, as lobbyists, as potential participants. So right there, people are interested in social justice and small business carve-outs and testing, more sophistication. So I think New Jersey is the cautionary tale that you can kind of get bogged down in all these details and getting going. So I would expect it's going to be a little slower than Colorado, which was super aggressive, kind of locked in, and probably a little faster than Washington, which took its time and didn't really have a deadline. But yeah, with the speed that they moved the legislation through, if they keep that pace up, they'll leapfrog Virginia and a bunch of places very quickly.
There we go. All right, let's take a turn to a new topic. During rehearsal, you were telling me about Delta 8, and so what is Delta 8?
Yeah, so we're going to go back to the plant, and this is something that as a business professor, I try to stay educated on, but it's really striking how little we still know about the cannabis plant, all its forms and all the things that can be extracted from it. And so one of the hot compounds coming out of this plant more recently has been this compound called Delta 8, like the number 8 THC. And just the naming alone gets very confusing, because THC we think of as the intoxicating thing that makes marijuana, and we think of CBD as not having THC. It's non-intoxicating. So I'm going to tell you things that are going to be confusing. First, you can extract this Delta 8 THC compound from either form of the plant, from a marijuana plant, which is high in what we normally call THC, which is actually Delta 9 THC, is kind of it's been the form that everyone's focused on. You can also extract it from hemp. Hemp, by legal definition, doesn't have the Delta 9 THC in high quantity, but it has Delta 8 THC in some level. So this is already a kind of a hybrid-y kind of compound. It could come from either source. And then it's also a little bit of a hybrid in terms of what it seems to do to people. So it has some intoxicating effects, some potency, but not nearly as much as Delta 9 THC, which is why it was never really regulated specifically or carved out. But yet, people have found it to be appealing for some uses. So the reason I bring this up just as an example is there's going to be a lot of this, I think, over the next few years and next few decades, because all this kind of learning and research was really prevented by the non-legality of the plant, right? The plant's been around, and scientists have been learning how to study every other compound in our pharmacy and in our region, but this was kind of off limits until recently. And even now we're a little bit hamstrung, but yet these things are being discovered and tried, and things are moving forward. So I would just say it's an example of something to look out for. They're like these new compounds that pop up, and then new companies and new kind of hotspots for innovation follow, particularly because if you think about what I just said, if you extracted this compound from hemp, there are a lot of states that view that as totally fine. They have hemp programs. They don't have any specific prohibition for it.
No,
so that's
state of Texas.
State of Texas. So that's really where the activity has been. Hey, I'm in a state where I can't participate in the legal marijuana market, Delta 9 THC market, but I can extract Delta 8. I'm in compliance with the Farm Bill. There are a few states that actually specify which type of THC, Delta 9 or 8. Colorado is one. So actually in Colorado, you couldn't really work with this new compound today because their law is actually a little more sophisticated, a little more specific. And so they've said it has to be Delta 9 on the marijuana side, et cetera, et cetera. So, lots of people are asking me, what is this thing? How do I understand where it's legal, where it's not? There's a lot of gray area. And I would say, everything I say is kind of general, and there's probably a lot to be figured out with a lawyer if you're going to get into it. But I think it's just a really interesting example where we're still learning so much, even though it might seem like this plant's been around for a long time. And, that can really push, hotspots of activity and investment and consumer interest where you might not expect it.
No, I concur. Three thoughts. One is one of the first pieces I did when I launched 420 MSP and I was typing was Jack and the Beanstalk. And it was about the barcode. I went to a research facility in South Seattle. The PhD type, present company accepted.
The real scientist there, probably. Yeah. I wouldn't claim to be one of those.
And my purpose there was to kind of get a photo of the barcode on the plants they were growing, right, and talk about that. But what they did, and I would have to revisit it, but somehow they got some government money to study and play around with the plant and the compound for epilepsy. And that was kind of their thing it's like, how in the heck did you do that? And Paul, that was a couple of years ago. So I actually kind of forget how they got the money, but the milestone wasn't lost on me because that's very difficult to get research funding. Then over on the other side of the aisle in my technology career, got a couple clients in Israel, and they've educated me that Israel is leading a lot of this research. And that doesn't surprise me, and and then back to your point, we don't know what we don't know. I mean, that's the opportunity in my eyes, right? Is I don't know. I'll try an analogy. Oil. I'm in the state of Texas, and oil used to be drilled straight down, right? And now they can do all this stuff, yeah. and I think that's where we're headed, right? Is into a period of innovation. Thoughts on that?
No, I think you're right. And part of the innovation that I see is pre-legalization, the plant was generally sold in full form, right? You bought flower and that was kind of all that was available from, someone in your neighborhood. That person was not a scientist who could go in and isolate certain compounds and test it and do everything else. Right? So not only did that not happen, but the skill set you needed was totally foreign to the market. It's only because of legalization now we're getting, as you say, these amazing scientists who know how to work with organic compounds, who have an agricultural background, but in a lab setting that can slice and dice and try and innovate. And so, to me, that is something you would want to know. And so it's legalization is making that happen. Now, what the commercial potential for all these substances is really complicated because they may be kind of a short-term, popular thing until we get full legalization and the whole plant is available to every state, or maybe they end up being really important and maybe, not that many people thought that a compound that doesn't get you quite so high is going to be really popular. And we see that already. There are people who want to be part of this industry as a consumer and not for that reason. And so maybe Delta 8 is a really important finding and it becomes a long, core part of someone's product set. So, again, it's exciting stuff because it's not like we've figured out all the mysteries in the cannabis plant, just the same way that we haven't figured out all the opportunities in the, supply side and, technology side and, marketing side, right? This is still very, very early days. So.
It is. It's akin to, and I'll start to wrap up on this. It's akin to the very early part of my technology career, and you did a round in technology, but Paul, in the late 80s, we were defining the local area network, right? And there was this ArcNet and Token Ring and TCP/IP, and we didn't know, right? We didn't know which way it was going to go, and it ultimately ended up being TCP/IP and the internet and so on. But it really exciting times, right? I can get my arms around that. So, in any event, well, thank you for your time as always. Appreciate the wisdom, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Thanks so much, Harry. Have a great week.